Hello and namaste. You've tuned in to episode 5 of the Foreign Policy podcast series Beyond Nation and State on Sunu India. I'm your host, Smita Sharma, and you can listen to all our episodes on the Sunu India app as well as on Apple and Spotify podcasts. Now, Pushp Kamal Dahel, or Prachanda, was on his first official visit, the first overseas official visit to India earlier this year, which was in June. And this was the first visit during his current, in fact, term as Prime Minister. Of course, he has served as Prime Minister three more times in the past two in Nepal. There were some important outcomes from his meeting with Prime Minister Modi, but also some controversies since he returned home, including over the mural depicting Akhand Bharat, including Nepal, on display in India's new parliament building. More recently, the film Adi Purush, which has managed to consistently, in fact, raise eyebrows on all sides of the ideological divide. It has also led to anger in Nepal. A dialogue of Adi Purush, in which Sita is mentioned as India's daughter, had led to the ban on all Hindi films, which was announced by the Kathmandu mayor Balendra Shah. Of course, then there was a court order following that as well. So, on this episode, while we will talk about some of the fault lines that continue to plague India Nepal relations, which otherwise has so much to offer, which has so much of deep history and civilizational ties, we will focus more on Nepal, and its society today. This is a small but a beautiful Himalayan country. Of course, this was formerly a kingdom that turned into a democratic republic in 2008, following the end of years of guerrilla war led by the then Maoist commander Prachanda, actually, that killed at least 17,000 people. Of course, there could be numbers that could be different over a period of some 16 years. And Nepal shares a 1,770 kilometers long border with India, particularly, in fact, with disputes on Kalapani, on Susta as well. So, discussions in Nepal, unfortunately, are also often limited to it being caught between the two great powers, the two Asian rivals, the giants, India and China. And we need to look at Nepal from its own prism first. So, to understand the political and societal shifts happening in fact, Nepal, I am joined today by Amish Raj Mulmi. He's an editor, a prolific writer who's based out of Kathmandu, and is also the author of an important book, which is All Roads Lead North, Nepal's Turn to China. Now, this book actually presents a historical context and also a long view of Nepal's foreign policy, its foreign relations, the rise and rise of China. It examines the histories that kind of bind the remote Himalayan communities to each other. And, I thought let's have a conversation around something that needs to be talked about. Amish, thank you so much for joining us on Beyond Nation and State. Sanjay, everything good?
Thank you. Thank you, Smita. All good, all good. Sanjay Sarita, how are you?
All well as one can get, of course, in the Delhi heats. But really, what is the kind of palpable change of climate change, in particular in the Kathmandu Valley where you live in? Because I do think that the increase with every passing year, the temperatures seem to be soaring in the valley too, just like in the plains.
Yeah, it's been a. I mean, we've already had a declaration that, like, I mean, there's been an announcement by the authorities that we'll have a deficient monsoon, and I think that's across the subcontinent. So it's become very erratic. It's become hotter, warmer for sure. I won't say as hot as Delhi, but yeah, I think we're also facing the heat here. And the plains here got really hot this time. So there was a heat wave, and there was a heat wave. Let's say, I mean, I think there was a heat advisory as well. So it was much worse in the plains, I would say, than in the hills. At least there's a little bit of respite here. So
Okay.
yeah.
I think even when you have pleasant temperatures, the political
Mm.
temperatures continue to be pretty heated in Nepal for some reason or the other. So, let me first actually get a quick reaction from you
Mm.
on the Prachanda visit,
Mm.
because there's an important tripartite power trade agreement draft which has been finalized. We are told between India, Nepal, and Bangladesh, and this basically will meet a long-standing demand from Nepal and Bangladesh to allow trading of power through the Indian grid. This was a key issue in talks too. How significant is this? How is being looked upon as, especially in terms of the regional connectivity?
So Smita, there are two parts to this, right? Like the first, I won't get into the technicalities, the engineering bits, because that's not something that I'm proficient at. But in terms of the larger, let's say, geopolitical or let's say the regional, let's say, outlook, I think it's a significant step. You have to remember that South Asia, we are culturally very similar, but economically we are one of the most disconnected regions of the world. And I think this step of it's a small step. It's just 40 megawatts at the moment. Or the approval is being given for 40 megawatts. But even if once, as I say, like I mean, once this moves through, once this even this 40 megawatt goes through, I think it'll pave the way for a larger idea of regional connectivity in South Asia. And I think that's more and more important in a region where you can see there's a lot of economic dynamism. You can see that there's a lot of population that is under the age of 40. There's a young population, and there is also, I mean, India is obviously growing, right? But you have countries like Bangladesh and Nepal as well, which is seeing significant shifts in the last few decades. So in those terms, and of course, the final part of it is that Nepal's hydropower potential has always been vaunted, right? Like ever since, I mean, even during my father's time, when he was a child, the idea of hydropower generation being the sort of uh, panacea for Nepal's development is, right, has always been there. So I think in when we look at it from these terms, A, regional connectivity, yes, it'll be a big boost. B, in terms of, let's say, integration, economic integration of the region, again, it will play a huge role. And finally, for Nepal's hydropower ambitions as well, I think this tripartite, let's say, trade agreement, even if it's 40 megawatt at the moment, paves the way for a larger, on a larger scale for it to be, let's say, deployed, for it to be, let's say, in the future. But let's see how it goes from here.
Right. You mentioned, of course, about the youth population. 70% of Nepal's population, if I'm not mistaken, is under the age of 40. Let me also, in fact, mention here quickly to the listeners that even my roots are Nepalese, with my father's parents kind of, they came in from Siangja in Nepal. And when you talk about the India-Nepal relationship, Amish, we always talk about, of course, the free borders, the large amount of trading, are the army sentiments, the Gorkha regiment ties. But the issue of the Indo-Nepal Friendship Treaty of 1950, it remains a contentious issue. There's been an eminent persons group report, which has been gathering dust for a decade now. So do you really think that there is a problem with this treaty that seriously needs a revision, or is this being used perhaps as a political tool every time there is some instability around?
There are, again, I think it is a little bit more than just whether it reads a revision or not, right? Like the fact is that the historical fact remains that the treaty was signed between an Indian ambassador and the Nepali prime minister at that time. So one of the demands of the Nepali side has been that, okay, if has to be a treaty of equals, then equal dignitaries from both sides have to sign. Now that is one facet of it. The other side of it, a lot of it is also got to do with the political sentiment regarding what exactly is derived out of the special relationship for Nepal vis-a-vis India, right? And there are differing, let's say, perspectives on this. My perspective is that as it stands, the Nepal-India relationship is unique, like you said, because of the open border. And I don't think there is any open border. There is any border that functions the way the India-Nepal border functions, the way, let's say, citizens from both countries can work, live in each other's countries without too many, let's say, hassles. And I think if if the treaty were to be revised that erodes on these points, I think that would be a great, let's say, disadvantage to both sides. Because it's not just Nepalis that are, let's say, benefiting out of the open border. It's also Indians. In fact, Indians send back a lot more remittance to from Nepal to India than the other way around. So in that, so there are a lot more Indians who are working in Nepal at the moment. So this any sort of revision of the treaty which erodes on these points, right, of freedom of movement, of freedom of living, of freedom, let's say the border, the way the border currently operates. I think it would be a real shame if that were to go.
Hmm.
So yes, of course, I mean the politics is always there, but if the treaty were to be revised, I would argue that these points that make this Nepal-India relationship special should be retained in some form or the other.
Okay. Now coming to this question of again the Prachanda visit, and this is just one of the last points I want to touch about the visit because another prominent voice in Nepal, Yubraj Ghimir, who of course writes regularly in Indian newspapers, including in the Indian Express, he wrote that Pushpa Kamal Dahal's visit to Mahakaleshwar temple in Ujjain was an attempt to showcase his Hindu credentials for the BJP government and to convince them his being in office was in India's best interest vis-a-vis China. Now we know that Prashant, of course, is a communist, somebody who's never been to temples, or if he's been to temples, he's never actually offered prayers. This time around, we saw a different image of him actually indulging in the entire rituals. What is happening there within Nepal? What is happening there within the political system? Is Prachanda changed man? Is there a demand for him to do so?
Uh, so one point that I'll emphasize over here is that I will not buy too much into the Nepali communists' supposed atheist credentials. I mean, most Nepali communists have shown for the past, like for the large part of their careers, that in the religion that they follow is sort of important to them, even if they don't indulge in it actively. And they have done that, especially when they're in public office. So, for example, KP Oli, when he was the prime minister, he gifted Pashupati, I believe, 108 kg gold something. Like, I mean, they were supposed to do install something at Pashupati. There's a big scandal going on around the scam right now, but that's my point. That I don't think, number one, that going by communism's atheist credentials, I don't think Nepali communists really qualify to be called as atheists. Number two, of course, I mean the symbolism is very very clear, right? I mean it's a similar symbolism as to when Prime Minister Modi comes to Nepal and goes to Pashupati or goes to Muktinath, right? And I mean he what essentially the visit signify is these religious linkages between the two countries. And I think Prachanda's sort of avatar this time is, I will agree that it is in a way sort of also a message that, all right, you in Delhi can trust me, because we have to remember that after the elections, there was a little bit of a period where Prachanda was not very happy with Dioba, who was his electoral partner, and he actually aligned with Oli and set up a formed a government. And Oli withdrew support to the government over the presidential elections. But Prachanda was essentially what he's trying to also, I would argue, is that he's trying to show that, all right, Delhi can trust me as a partner. Delhi can, let's say, like, it's not, I am no longer the firebrand revolutionary that I was, let's say, about 15 years ago. And look at, I'm a changed man, essentially. And I think uh, that is the message that I would argue this Ujjain visit sort of gave. Of course, the larger imagery around, let's say, the Hindu symbolism around it, all of that is obviously out there for everyone to see, right? So there isn't much to comment about that. But to me, I think it is also a large part of it is basically Prachanda just trying to tell Delhi that you can trust me as a leader. I will work in India's interest. It is not that I am I am that old revolutionary that I once was. I think that was the main point. So,
Why I also ask this is because there was a report recently by an Indian journalist, Kunal
mm,
Purohit, that seemed to suggest that there are a lot of, in fact, RSS or RSS led outfits that are working in Nepal and organizations that are working in tandem, of course, with political outfits within Nepal, with trying to promote the call that maybe Nepal should revert to being a monarchy. For the youth in Nepal today, for Nepal as a society today, are there times when you see that there is this strong yearning that we should go back into being a Hindu kingdom, a Hindu, or a monarchy, or it's like, the feeling that we are a democratic republic now, we are flawed, but this is what is best for us.
No, so Smita, see again, if you talk about monarchy in general, right? Like in Nepal, I have a simple argument that just because something is not going right now does not mean that you revert to an even worse system, right? And monarchy was that. And I don't, a large part of those who are arguing for reversal to monarchy or Hindu monarchy inside Nepal right now, it's a very small constituency. It is not. They are a minority at the moment currently. Whether this may change in the future, I really don't know.
But
But
are they ordinary citizens or essentially
no,
political voices?
there are both ordinary citizens as well as political voices, without doubt, right? But the second part of this is, like you said, a large part of Nepal's population is also very young, and especially if you see, we have had what? I mean, 2008, right? We've already had 15 years, 16 years since the monarchy was abolished. And there's a new generation out there that is already, I mean, there is already a generation that is not identifying with the Maoist civil war. And what the Maoist civil war was about, why Nepal needed to overthrow the monarchy, the 2006 People's Revolution. I don't think there is a generation that is fully aware of these facets. So they have seen life under the republic. They have, and certainly in the sense that if you compare in terms of income growth, if you compare in terms of development, let's say like markers, indicators, Nepal has done much better as it was during than it was during the monarchy, right? So that's the one part. Now, whether the RSS is also promoting this, how is this, let's say, India connected to this larger debate? There are two. I see this as two-part question, right? The first is whether there is a group in the RSS that wants a reversal to a Hindu monarchy. And the second is whether the group will be satisfied with a reversal to a Hindu state, that is, an cancellation of secularism and reversing to a Hindu state without the monarchy, a Hindu republic, right? Which is, like, let's say, the more prominent, I would call it, voice than, let's say, it is the support for the monarchy is. Now, both these voices, what they sort of also, I mean, they're also working at crosshairs, right? Because the thing is, Nepali leaders are also voicing their, let's say, discontent against secularism. But whether they are voicing the same, that whether the discontent against secularism means equates to a support for monarchy, I don't think that's necessarily true. That is the first part inside Nepal. Now, the second part is whether that secular, let's say, like, I mean, the reverting to a Hindu state, does that mean that the constitution as it currently states is that Nepal is a secular state with which follows Sanatan Dharma, right? And Sanatan Dharma has essentially been identified as religion and cultural practices that are traditional to Nepal, which essentially means Hinduism and Buddhism to a certain extent. But the religious roles of the head of state have not gone away. So the head of state, which is the president at the moment, an elected president, may I add, is still attending religious functions as the king used to attend earlier. So I don't think the Hindu nature of the Nepali state has really gone away, right? In terms of, let's say, how the roles of the head of state were defined in the Hindu kingdom, yes, there are certain, let's say, I mean, the king used to actively, let's say, promote Brahmanism, the king used to actively promote, let's say, Hindu way of life. I don't think that is happening as much, but the roles, the religious roles of the Hindus, of the king, of the head of state, are still prevalent even in Republic Nepal. So that obviously is there. Now, on the other side, whether the RSS has been asking for it about these reports, even the US State Department, I think, recently released a report that said that BJP was involved in actively, let's say, like, lobbying with parties here in Nepal for a reversal to a Hindu state. My sense is that unless the BJP slash Indian state does not actively or overtly state its support towards a secular republic in Nepal, these, let's say, theories will continue to abide. That is also an outcome of these age old relationships that India and Nepal share. So, for
Hmm.
example, and I'm sure you know that Yogi Adityanath is essentially the Mahant of the Shah dynasty. So he is both a political leader in India as well as a religious leader for the kings of Nepal. So as long as these roles continue, these sort of theories, these sort of, let's say, like speculations about the RSS and its role in Nepal will continue. So
Hmm.
Delhi has a choice. I mean, Delhi can actively dispel these rumors by stating its support for a secular republic in Nepal.
Hmm.
That's, uh, I think that
But
that
of course, that will
yeah,
lead
yeah,
to their own political
yeah, yeah,
complications back home
yeah,
itself.
yeah, yeah.
But Amish, I mean, one of the other factors also here is that
Hmm.
it's been 15 years now since 2008 and the abolition of the monarchy. But the political instability continues. I mean, it's difficult to remember who is the prime minister of Nepal. You've had almost
Hmm.
13 prime ministers in 15
Yeah.
years. What explains this? Is Can all of this really be attributed to constantly New Delhi pulling the rug from under the feet of some leader, or China wanting to hobnob, or is it really about, institutional instability with perhaps corruption at the heart of it?
Uh, I will actually argue that it neither of what you're saying is plays a big role. In fact, what plays a bigger role is essentially that Nepal is a political, let's say, like unit. Nepal is a polity where no single ideology slash party dominates. Right? We have had, let's say, for the most part, the Congress and the UML are pretty much it is a left dominated polity in that Nepali voters are traditionally very left oriented. So you will never have a party which is outright, let's say, capitalist. You will never have a party that is outright voicing for the private sector and looking at reforms that they may be doing it within through their policies and everything, but they will not do it openly. So because of that, the Congress and the UML are pretty much neck to neck in most parts of the country. And then you have the Maoists, which is a significant party, but a smaller size than both these parties. And then you have a variety of other parties that are both breakaways from these mother parties or new parties like the RSP that has come up, right? And so because of that, no party has been able to achieve an outright majority in parliament. And one may argue that the Nepal Communist Party before these elections had a two-thirds majority, but we have to also remember that the NCP was a coalition that was built out of the Maoists and UML, with Beijing encouraging them from the back, right? So they had Oli and Prachanda essentially overcame certain ideological differences to come together as the NCP. But those ideological differences slash, let's say, or a desire for power between, let's say, the power sharing agreements that did not work out between the two led to both of their, let's say, the NCP collapsing. Now, what that also suggests is that in Nepal's polity, personal interests often trump national interests. So leaders are willing to topple governments if their interests, personal interests that is, aren't met. We've seen this happen even in the 1990s when Girija Prasad Koirala from the Congress actually toppled his own government of Krishna Prasad Bhattarai. So this has been long in the making. So I don't think this is necessarily an outcome of the republic. I think this is how the Nepali polity has itself, come to be. I wouldn't say design, but it's come to be this way. That
So,
where, yeah,
what is stopping the rise of a visionary leader, who, as you say, does not want to put personal interest in front of national interest? Because the power equations are so unstable. Are there any new voices in the offing, new voices on the rise that give this hope? What will, lead to this kind of a substantive change in the polity?
no, I think uh, the idea that okay, there has to be one visionary leader who can change society. I think that is I don't particularly subscribe to that idea. I think change is some gradual. Change is a sort of a any sort of political economic change. It is a gradual, let's say, unit. And I think that is one of the mistakes that we've made in Nepal, that we've assumed that every revolution slash, let's say, we've overthrown the king and now everything will be fine. We've written the constitution and now everything will be fine. And I think those expectations must be subdued in favor of a more gradual idea of change, where solid political and economic change begins from changing the institutional structures themselves, where you have a more dynamic and inclusive institutional mechanisms that address not just these historical inequities that have created multiple, let's say, power centers as a result. You have to address those historical inequities. Unless you do those, I don't think you can have, let's say, a grand visionary leader as such. Now, as to whether there is change happening or not, I will argue that there is actually a lot of change that has happened in Nepali politics since 2008, uh, particularly since 2015 itself, since the constitution actually empowered and created these three tiers of government. The local government, as we've seen, you were talking about Balen Shah. Like, I mean, the fact that Balen Shah, who is a complete outsider to politics, without any party backing, wins a landslide election, by a landslide in Kathmandu, which is pretty much the most populated metropolis and the largest metropolis in all of Nepal, says a lot about how Nepali politics itself is changing. We
mm,
have seen that we have seen also with the rise of parties like the Rashtriya Swatantra Party and the Janmat Party in the Tarai, as well as the Nagrik Unmukt Party in the far west, which is of the Tharus, that there is a political mobilization that is happening, going beyond traditional ideologies of the Congress slash UML slash Maoists. There is a constituency, there is a Nepali public that is willing to put their, let's say, faith in a new crop of leaders who subscribe to not just ideological, let's say, like inclinations, but to actually, let's say, when someone like a Robbie Lamichane of the RSP makes anti-corruption his primary agenda, you can
mm,
automatically sense that he is capitalizing on the discontent that is feeding, that has really like seeped into Nepali society. Like you said, it's been 15 years of the republic, and we haven't
mm,
seen any significant change. That discontent has spread into the Nepali voter, which is why the RSP has become the fourth largest party in Nepal's parliament in its very first outing. 5 years ago, I would not give RSP a chance, but
mm,
a lot has changed even in 5 years, right? For a party like the RSP to become this significant voice in Nepali politics, and I think
mm,
that shift, especially among the youth, of non-ideological, let's say, affinity towards old parties, of, let's say, discontent against traditional or the more geriatric readers who have absolutely, you know, blocked any sort of vertical entries, lateral entries into their parties by younger people. There are no younger leaders who have been groomed, right? All
mm,
of these and the prevalent corruption, all of these have led to a situation where the existing political parties, the traditional political parties, are feeling the heat. And the reason, I will argue that a lot of the reason why Prachanda is insisting on these connectivity with India, pushing these economic, let's say, relationship with India, even in his last visit, is because he wants to be seen again. He wants to be seen as a leader who is delivering, you know,
mm,
and because that has been one of the biggest grouses that leaders don't deliver in Nepal. But now, with the rise of these parties, with these new political forces, even the old parties are being forced to take note that, all right, unless we
mm.
deliver, we may, it may be a death knell in the next election. So,
So I think that's an important shift, that there is a sense of increasing accountability being forced onto leaders who could otherwise go on, without really delivering, as you said. And there is that youth shift that is forcing it into. But, would you say that in India's outreach to Nepal, that it's not completely understanding the shifts, the societal shifts, the demographic shifts. We are not really talking to Nepal still about our unicorns, about medical tourism, about the other potential. Today, other than India, of course, the largest inward remittances to Nepal are coming in from people who are traveling to Saudi, to Malaysia, who are working there. Nepalese students are going to Chinese universities in large numbers. That got affected, of course, during COVID. Uh, how would you define the changing psyche of Nepalese youth? Is there also that long shadow of the blockade, that India led in 2015? And is India being able to read the pulse on the ground?
So, see, the blockade, and this is something I wrote in my book as well, that one of the biggest mistakes that India did with the blockade is that it has left a, the first political impression of India among the youth is that of the blockade. It has become a solid political memory. And I think that it will be difficult for India to overcome that for sure, right? But it is also a fact that in the last few years, especially post 2017, 2018 onwards, India has withdrawn itself from the political, overtly from the political space, right? As it used to be earlier. It is no longer as visible as it used to be in the political space, at least. But it has also gone ahead and pushed this economic connectivity agenda, right? Which is all well and good. But India has also missed out on one important facet of the India-Nepal relationship that used to be historically very, very important was that a lot of Nepalis, young Nepalis used to go and study in India. In fact, I did as well. Now, young Nepalis don't no longer want to go to India to study. Their first choice is the US or it's Australia, UK, or China. Like you said, like I mean, there's Japan also, but Australia and US are actually the number one choices. And I think that this what where Delhi has not caught the pulse of Nepal is the idea of the global Nepali, where Nepalis are today present in more than 150 countries across the world, where Nepalis today make up the third largest immigrant population in Australia and among the top 10 largest immigrant populations in the US as well. So as long it's a similar situation with I could argue with how the US itself has finally recognized Indian Americans as a potent political force after so many years, right? Like until now there was a lot of talk about corporates and Indian Americans heading corporates, and but finally the political value of Indian Americans is being understood. I don't think India has understood the value of younger Nepalis and how they are creating the narrative, how they are shaping the narrative in the days to come, in the years to come. In fact, you can see with the way social media has taken off here. You can see with the way new younger entrepreneurs are doing things over here that there is a distinct westward tilt. It is no longer a tilt that is India oriented as it used to be earlier. And I think that is a point where I think Delhi can work upon.
Right. It's interesting you brought that issue out about perceptions because I was just going through this report that has come out, and in fact, I would recommend it to the listeners also. It's by CACP or the erstwhile Brookings because they have just brought out a research paper by scholars in the region, which is called "How China Engages South Asia: Themes, Partners, and Tools." This all actually also has an article by Akhilesh Upadhyay on Nepali students in China, as well as by Amish on the charm offensive shaping Chinese perceptions in Nepal. Amish, I'm very curious if you could just share some of the pointers here from your chapter in particular, because on the one hand, when you have India not being able to read the mood, when it comes to the Chinese, are they being able to do something with the youth there, especially in terms of these perceptions? How are they building these perceptions, these narratives within Nepal?
I will not say that China has also fully succeeded in, let's say, like like engaging Nepal's youth, right? Because if you go to, let's say, like I mean whenever I end up at, let's say, a Chinese embassy or slash a Chinese embassy supported, let's say, event, most of the faces I see are the old, let's say, the leftists that you usually see. So I don't think China has also agreed. Well, like China has also been able to capture that pulse of the youth. But where it differs is that, for example, I'll just not exactly part of the paper, but as we speak, there is a dragon boat race festival happening in Pokhara right now on the lake, where a, a chartered flight from Chengdu was brought in with about 4 or 5 teams of Chinese nationals and I think 1 or 2 teams of Nepalese. And they are competing in this dragon boat, which is a traditional boat, I believe, of China. And they're having a boat race of sorts. And the ambassador is there. And he's been, of course, he once again identified the Pokhara airport as a BRI project when Nepal is saying that it's not. But these sort of pushes, right? These sort of pushes are what actually shapes Chinese perceptions in Nepal. I argue in the paper that it has helped China to sort of push the narrative around its version of, let's say, like how it rejects the name Everest, right? It calls the name Everest as a colonial relic, and it prefers to be called Chomolungma, which is the Tibetan slash Sinicized name, or Sagarmatha, which is the Nepali name, right? So that is one part of how China is pushing its, let's say, narrative in Nepal. Second part of it is how China is able to shape narratives around Tibet inside Nepal, where it where it has held exhibitions showing how 60 years of Chinese rule has emancipated Tibet from serfdom, has economically developed Tibet, and provided a lot of benefits to Tibetans inside Tibet at the moment. And there are a lot of, and of course, the emphasis on China's Tibet is always there, right? And then there's a larger idea of how China also frames its diplomatic relationship with bilateral ties vis-a-vis Nepal, wherein it calls it's sometimes it's as high as Everest, sometimes it's brother to brother, like almost sibling sort of relationship, and essentially steering clear of the most contentious issues, but emphasizing Nepal's sovereignty, Nepal's territory, Nepal's independence, and I think for a small country, these points are very, very, let's say, like these terms are always loaded terms that create anxieties. So when a great power or a neighbor is assuring Nepal of these things, Nepalis automatically tend to take away sort of a more positive perception of that. And then the last point is obviously that China, until about 2008, had not been visible in Nepali politics. And I think that impression has sort of also created a separate perception of China within the country, of China as a, let's say, a bilateral partner that engages in development, that engages in, let's say, economic partnerships or aid without getting into the domestic politics of Nepal, unlike India. So I think, and there's also the saying, right? Like familiarity breeds contempt. So we are, as Nepalis, we are a lot more familiar with Indians. So we assume that we know India through and through. But Chinese, yes, we don't know the language. They're also far away from us. They're also new neighbors to us. Technically, I mean, they became neighbors only after 1950, in a sense. So it's still getting used to them. So there is a lot more positive, let's say, views, perceptions around them. Mm.
Just a last question as I wrap up this conversation. And also, just to clarify to our listeners, to our viewers, when Amish talks about the ongoing Dragon Festival, we are recording this conversation on 23rd of June, a
Oh,
Friday.
yeah.
And of course, the podcast drops on another date. But Amish, coming to the final question of China, because I can have a long conversation with you, maybe in a subsequent, in fact, follow-up episode. Uh, we are seeing, you spoke about the Chinese political interference, which is not just vis-a-vis Nepal, by the way. I mean, we have seen
Mm.
China trying to build infrastructural bridges with a lot of countries and regions of the world, which where now it is politically active from South Asia to West Asia. So there are things that are happening that are changing within China also. But you have Nepal, which signed that 8-point infrastructure agreement with China. It joined the BRI, the Border Roads Initiative. Nepal also wants India to provide, in fact, air access for flights, to the two newly built airports, one of which you mentioned about Pokhara, Bhairava, but these are built by Chinese. So you're not seeing that response from India. Is there enough material on the ground among common people to constantly compare, oh, what is India doing, what is China doing? Is that a comparison that constantly plays out on the ground amongst common people?
I'll say yes. I think it's a constant. I think it's a constant comparison, and it's a constant comparison not just among the people, but also among leaders. I think there is a constant leaders, the media. I think there is a constant, and I think one of the disadvantages of being saddled with only two neighbors is that you have to constantly talk about two neighbors because you are a landlocked country, right? So you're constantly sort of like looking at these sort of aspects of what one country is doing vis-a-vis what the other neighbor is doing, right? So, like for example, during the pandemic, or even after the pandemic, when China had eased its borders and everything, but it hadn't opened up the land borders with Nepal, a lot of a lot of people were actually saying, "Oh, we thought China would not be like India, but now it also has put an undeclared blockade on our borders." Right. So there were terms like these coming out in the media, in the let's say in the regular everyday conversation. So I think that comparison will always exist, and I think
Hmm.
that is one of the facets of also being a great power. If you are a
Hmm.
great power, right, you will constantly be compared to other great powers, right? I mean, you want to project influence, you want to project your power, you will constantly be held up to task by saying, oh, look, this other country is doing this much. I mean, that is
Hmm.
the reason why the US comes in and gives Nepal a $500 million grant versus and explicitly with the US Assistant Deputy Secretary of State saying that unlike China, our support to Nepal is in Nepal's interests and not in China's interests. You
Hmm.
know, so countries I will argue that India and China, also the US, are also constantly comparing themselves in Nepal and in other countries vis-a-vis each other. So
Okay. That constant comparison, of course, happens all the time, and in India a lot of, in fact, the people feel that, you are doomed if you do, you're doomed if you don't. But the two controversies that I mentioned at the start, Amish, the Adi Purush controversy and the Akhand Bharat mural controversy, do you see them being, in fact, controversies that could flame up into something big at the moment, or are they kind of limited to only certain individuals and certain pockets?
so I think that what's happened is that there are India's neighborhood policy in recent times, right? India's neighborhood policy in recent times, a lot of it has been around economic and cultural links, right? And it's done that a lot. And Nepalese, I mean, there's now a train to Janakpur saying Ayodhya Express. There's this Buddhist diplomacy that India is pushing in Lumbini. All of that is obviously one part of it. But what's also happened is India under Modi is also seeing a more assertive foreign policy where the contours of domestic policies, right, domestic politics, domestic nationalism is also coming through in, let's say, its foreign policy. It's interfering with its foreign policy, right, with these, let's say, connectivity outreach programs. So I see the mural, particularly in Parliament, as being one of those instances where where India has enshrined a contentious map of contentious mural that is not just and it's not just from Nepal's perspective, from Bangladesh as well as Pakistan's perspective. And Afghanistan obviously hasn't reached out, hasn't said anything on the issue, but Afghanistan also will probably take
Hmm.
issue with that larger, let's say, map. Yes, the external affairs minister said that it is sort of depicts more in India, but that is a I don't think any, let's say, country in the neighborhood has bought that explanation. I
The
think,
civilizational,
yeah, I
undivided
think,
India
yeah,
depiction.
and especially when the parliamentary affairs minister is tweeting out saying Akhand Bharat is a reality now. So I think those anxieties will be created by Hindutva's impact on India's foreign policy. So that is regarding the mural. With Adi Purush, it is a more localized, let's say, I would call it a more localized, let's say, version of this larger cultural nationalism that RSS is pushing in India and affecting the neighbors. But you have to be a little careful, especially with India and Nepal, because the thing is that anti-Indianism is also a potent political weapon. It's a potent political ideology here in Nepal, as Balan Shah has shown. And this move of banning Bollywood films until the filmmakers apologize, which the Indian filmmakers have apologized, huh, by the way. And the
Hmm.
dialogue is apparently not in the film at all. I haven't watched it, but
No,
some
neither
some
have I.
yeah, but some people who did watch the film have said the dialogue is not there in the film at all. So despite that, Balin Shah continues to, just stand down, defy court orders. In fact, release a statement saying the government and the court are India's slaves. So what
Hmm.
he is doing is that he is using the controversy around Adipurush to strengthen his own anti-Indian, pro-Nepali nationalist credentials. And he did that when he installed the Greater Nepal map as a response
Hmm.
to the mural in Parliament as well. So I will regard both of them as separate, but
Hmm.
I will also say that this larger push towards Hindutva inside India is having an effect on its foreign policy, particularly in the neighborhood for sure.
Okay. Finally, Amish, is there any paper, any book written by a Nepalese author that you would recommend to our listeners? Because I'm not sure how much of that really seeps through here.
Uh, so there are actually quite a few books, right? You have Prachanda's Battles of the New Republic, you have Sudhir Sharma's The Nepal Nexus, you have Manjushri Thapa's multiple novels as well as non-fiction on Nepal. But two new books that I haven't read, but I've heard very, very good things about. One is Smriti Ravindra's The Woman Who Climbed Trees, which is a novel that's been getting rave reviews across the world. And I think if to understand, let's say, the Madhya Plains, let's say, like discontent with Nepal, the larger socio-political relationship, this is an important novel to begin from. And alongside this is another book called Plains of Discontent by Maximilian Moch, which is again about the Tarai's relationship, the Madhya Plains relationship with the hill, let's say, side of Nepal. And both of these books, I'm actually looking forward to it very much.
Hmm.
Apart from that, there are a lot of academic works if your readers will be interested in that. So,
And
yeah.
no, I think also, for the
No.
unversed, I would recommend
Mm.
the novels, as
Yeah.
Amish mentioned, written by Manjushri Thapa. She has a
Yeah.
wonderful body of work too. But
Yeah.
Amish, this has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining
Thank
me
you so
here
much,
on
Smita.
Beyond Nation and State. And I just hope that in New Delhi, actually there's still very limited authentic Nepali or Nevar cuisines restaurants. Many of them keep confusing the people between Tibetan cuisines, Chinese cuisines, Asian cuisines, but very few authentic outlets. I hope that increases because I suddenly have a craving for Nepali food, which I need to
If you
take
come
care of.
down,
I know that's
if you come down over here, what I can promise you is that I can get you some authentic Chinese food, but not authentic Indian food.
I will actually stick to Chinjali there because I think the Indians tend to do a good mix with the Chinese Punjabi food. So, but
Yeah,
thank you so much, Amish.
my
And
pleasure.
that's all that I have on this episode of Beyond Nation and State, where we try and look into what's happening within Nepal. How is its society changing? And that important point being mentioned that India needs to read the pulse of a Naya Nepal, of a changing Nepal, particularly the global Nepalis. So if you liked this episode, do share your feedback. I am on Twitter as Smita underscore Sharma. Send your brickbats, but also send some love for us. And you can listen into all the episodes of Beyond Nation and State on Sunu India app, on Apple and Spotify. Take care.